Hello everyone. In the first video for the bonus week, we talked about the voting history of Virginia. And I noted that blacks were excluded explicitly from voting up until the 14th and 15th Amendments are passed. And even then, they were largely excluded through poll taxes and literacy tests. What we're going to focus on in this video is that period of time during Reconstruction, so as we emerge from the Civil War, where the 15th Amendment explicitly gives blacks the right to vote, saying that you cannot abridge that right to vote on the basis of race or color. And so we have this window of time in the 1860s, or really the 1870s, where black voters become an important voting bloc in the South before states start passing laws like Virginia's law about poll taxes that start to abridge that right to vote again. What we're going to think about is what happened during that brief period of time when blacks are enfranchised in the South. Did it make a difference in terms of their economic outcomes? So one thing I want to make clear right from the get-go is that there was this period of political power for the Southern black population that then disappeared with these stricter state voting laws that came in later in the 1800s. So what you're looking at here is in the U.S. House of Representatives. How many representatives are black? And you can see that in modern times, we have a small but not insignificant number. There's this period of no black representatives in sort of the first half of the 20th century. But if we look right after the Civil War here, we actually do see a fair number of black representatives in the House. And one thing you have to keep in mind here to put these numbers in context is that the House is much smaller back then. Right? So we grew the size of the House of Representatives as there were more people in the United States to represent, right, as population growth continued. So seeing that there's these black representatives early on, the scale is actually quite different, right? If we think about that number of representatives relative to the total House compared to these numbers over here in the 2000s, right? That makes this Reconstruction period more impressive in terms of black political representation. So here's what I mean by that with the U.S. House of Representatives. So you can see back in the late 1700s, right, we have fewer than 100 representatives. Steadily growing through the 1800s, with the exception of when we have states leave the Union, right, during the Civil War, and then continuing to grow again up until the early 1900s, where we effectively hit our current size. And so when I showed you those numbers for black representatives in the 1870s here, right, you're talking about a House that's almost 50% smaller than today's House of Representatives. It kind of gives you a different context for those numbers. We could also look at the number of black political leaders in the Senate, and far fewer in total numbers here. But once again, you see that while we've had a handful of black senators in the 2000s, in the late 1900s, absolutely none in the first half of the 20th century, but we actually get black senators during Reconstruction here. So once again, we've got this brief period of black political representation immediately after the Civil War that's then going to be taken away through Jim Crow laws and only going to reemerge after the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So what we're going to look at specifically in this video is some very recent work by Trevon Logan on the effects of black enfranchisement during Reconstruction. So I've got the working paper version of this from 2018 up on our class website, but there's actually now a version of the Journal of Economic History published just this year. So what Logan's central question is during this brief period of Reconstruction, when there was actually black political power because of the enfranchisement of black citizens, when they elected black officials, how did those black officials influence local government finance? How much money did they have to raise through taxes? What did they spend that money on in terms of public goods, right? How did they transform the way that local governments influenced kind of economic outcomes and helped close socioeconomic gaps? So we know with certainty that there are these huge black-white gaps emerging from the Civil War. The black population had been enslaved. They had very few rights in terms of owning property. They couldn't vote. Right? They're discriminated against in nearly every way imaginable. And so when Reconstruction begins, you've got this big chasm between black and white outcomes and black and white opportunities. So did having black officials help close that gap? That's the fundamental question behind Logan's paper. So the main thing he's going to do is basically see which counties elected black officials during Reconstruction, and did those counties have different outcomes than those counties that didn't elect black officials. So the focus here is on the South. Right? This is still where the vast majority of the black population resides after the Civil War. And what Logan's going to do is take this information from a book by Foner, where Foner actually kind of wrote down the bibliographic details of all of the black political leaders during Reconstruction. So what you're looking at here are the counties in the South, and the darker the shade of the county here, the more black officials elected in that county. Right? So the main thing I want you to take away from this map is sort of two things. First of all, black officials are being elected throughout the South during Reconstruction. There's a lot of counties there with black officials. Second, even within states, there's a lot of variation in terms of which counties elected black officials and how many black officials were elected. That's the kind of variation that Logan hopes to use to say, does that variation drive differences in taxes? Does it drive differences in the spending of those taxes, and differences in how that spending works? Who benefits from that spending? All right, so here are kind of the basic summary statistics of the data that Logan's working with. All right, he's got about 1,300 different black officials during Reconstruction. They tend to be born around 1830, right? They're entering office around 1869 here. They're leaving office around 1873. On average, 64% are literate. You can see that about 30% were born a slave, about 24% were property owners. Okay? In terms of what types of positions these black officials are taking, we've got a third are going into executive positions. So think about a mayor, for example. Right? About half of them are going to legislative positions. So think about city councils, think about state legislatures, state representatives, right? And then we've got about 10% taking judgeships, going into the judiciary. All right, so let's do the most basic thing you could imagine in terms of the econometrics here to see if having additional black officials affects outcomes in your county. What Logan's looking at in this table, called OLS estimates, is running just a basic linear regression. That's what OLS means here, ordinary least squares. It's our simplest linear regression. The outcome variable is county taxes per capita in 1870. So effectively we're asking, do the independent variables here drive variation in how much a county relies on taxes, how much a county raises in taxes? So a county that's going to provide more public goods has to do so by raising more taxes. That's kind of what we're thinking about here. So there are lots of controls here for how big your county is in terms of population, what the proportion black is in your county, how valuable the farms are, how much manufacturing you have. Lots of different things you could control for here to try to take care of potential emitted variable bias. And then the variable we care about is this black officials per county, right? Exactly how many black officials were elected in this particular county. So the way we're going to interpret the coefficient on black officials per county is if a county were to elect one more black official compared to another county, how much higher on average or lower on average are the county taxes per capita we end up seeing those officials vote for, enact. Okay? And so if you look at those numbers, it's about 10 cents more, right? 10 cents more per capita. That sounds really small in our 2020 minds, but 10 cents per capita is actually pretty big for two reasons, right? One reason is because we're talking $1870 here. So 10 cents in 1870 is worth a lot more than 10 cents in 2020. The other thing is that governments are much smaller. Taxes are much smaller. Public spending is much smaller. Right? So it's a very different world in 1870, and so an extra 10 cents in county taxes per capita is a really big difference in how much effort you're putting into providing public goods in your local county. And what Logan's finding here is that electing more black officials, basically as opposed to electing more white officials, leads to higher county taxes, higher investment in public goods. But we've got a problem with this kind of straightforward, basic linear regression. Our problem is really that all of these controls we're throwing in here are never going to be sufficient. The counties that elect black officials are going to differ from counties that don't elect black officials on all sorts of dimensions that we're not going to be able to capture with other variables. So what we have is what economists would call an endogeneity problem here. All right, meaning that the independent variable we care about, in this case the number of black officials, is actually what we call endogenous. It depends on other variables that we can and sometimes can't include in our model. Okay, so the reason that's a problem is we don't know if it's those other variables that are really driving taxes per capita. So it could be that counties that tend to elect black officials are counties that both before and during and after Reconstruction tend to prefer greater public goods provision. And so it has nothing to do with the black official per se, right? It has to do with this underlying characteristic of the county, right, that's driving both of these variables, the number of black officials and taxes per capita. And so it's really not a chain of causation from black officials to taxes per capita. It's this third variable that's driving changes in both. Okay, so another way to think about that is if we could go back to 1870 and randomly assign a black official to a county, it might not have the effect that we expect from those regression estimates I just showed you, right? Because it was that omitted variable, that unobserved variable, that's making the difference, not the black official himself. Okay, so how do we get around that problem? How do we get around this endogeneity problem? There's a lot of modern economics papers and political science papers that think about the effect of electing certain types of politicians, all right? And one of the best ways they have of getting convincing estimates and getting around this particular endogeneity problem is they look at close elections, all right? So they're going to look at elections where, say, the Republican candidate won with 50.1% of the vote, right? Versus elections where the Democratic candidate won with 50.1% of the vote versus 49.9% for the Republican candidate. Okay? So let's look at some actual data from the 2016 presidential election to get a better sense of what I'm talking about. Here are all the counties in the United States on a histogram. All right, so there's, I think, 3,000 some counties in the United States showing the percent vote margin for Republicans in the presidential election in 2016. Okay, so it's a histogram. Each bar shows the number of counties that fall in that bin. So if we were to look at this little bar right here, right, the number on the vertical axis is telling us how many counties Hillary Clinton won by 50%, right? Whereas over here, these are counties where Donald Trump won by 50%. Okay. So the county that Donald Trump wins by 50% is a fundamentally different type of county than the county that Hillary Clinton wins by 50%. So you can imagine that those two counties differ along all kinds of observable and unobservable characteristics, and I'm sure you can guess some of these characteristics, right? If I asked you what types of counties in 2016 tended to vote for Trump, what types of counties tended to vote for Clinton, you could probably give me a few different characteristics, and I'm certain you'd be pretty correct on that. So we can't think of the differences between those two types of counties as being related to who they decided to elect president, right? That presidential election is just proxying for all those other big differences between the counties. But if I look at counties that are right here at 0, okay, where they pretty much split the difference, right? Well, in one of those counties, it was just 1 or 2 voters that pushed the election over the edge for Trump. In the other county, it was 1 or 2 voters that pushed that county's results just over the edge for Clinton. Okay? That extra 1 or 2 voters, right, that's just kind of a little blip. In general, these two counties look roughly the same. Okay? So take a step back. Don't think about the presidential election. Think about the local election. And let's just assume that, you know, if the Republican presidential candidate carries the election in your county, the Republican mayoral candidate also wins in your county. Okay? If the Democratic presidential candidate wins in your county, then the Democratic mayoral candidate wins in your county. So now we've got 2 counties where it's just a blip, just this random deviation about getting 1 extra voter out to the polls that determine whether you got a Republican or Democratic mayor. Okay? So now, if we see how those two counties evolve over the next 4 years, right, they were essentially the same county, except for just randomly getting nudged to Democrat or Republican in terms of mayor. So if we see differences emerge in those counties over time, now we can think those differences are largely due to whether you elected the Democrat or the mayor, or the Democrat or the Republican as mayor. Okay? So that's kind of the cutting edge approach to thinking about this stuff. The problem that Logan's going to have is that he can't go back and realistically think that he can gather data on all these different local elections in the South in the 1870s and find really close ones, right? That's simply potentially a horribly taxing data collection thing to do, or simply impossible. The data may simply not be there. Okay? It's both because we're trying to go back to 1870, but also because a lot of these elections are very local elections. So you don't have systematic data collected at like a state level for this. So what Logan's going to do to try to solve this endogeneity problem is take an approach that we call instrumental variables. So you may have seen this in some of your other economics classes. It's something that's going to pop up a couple more times in our class. But what it basically means, here's a definition from Colin Cameron's econometrics textbook, is that this instrument z, okay, this is going to be our new variable, our instrumental variable z, has a property that changes in z are associated with changes in x. So x is the explanatory variable we care about. Okay, so in this case, a number of black politicians that are, but do not lead to change in y. So y is the outcome we care about. So taxes per capita here, aside from the indirect route through x. Okay, so whatever variable we come up with here, right, we're going to say, okay, it could influence taxes per capita, but only because it changes the value for x. So if you want to think about this as a little picture, a little diagram of how things are happening, we're trying to talk about how black politicians, our x here, influence spending per capita, our y. Our issue is that there's all kinds of characteristics for counties that we don't observe, so call those u, that make a county more likely to elect a black politician and also directly make that county more likely to have high taxes per capita. And because it's increasing both of those things, it makes it look to us in the data like x is increasing y, even though it's really about u increasing both of them. So our instrument z, if it only works through x influencing y, then it's going to just pick out the variation in x that's due to z and leave out all the variation in x that's due to u. So if we get rid of that variation that's due to u, then whatever's left should be x's real effect on y, not the stuff confounded with u's effect on y. Okay, that's the basic idea here. So how's this going to work in the context of Logan's study? Well, he's got to find a variable that directly affects the likelihood of electing a black politician, but is uncorrelated with all the other county traits that influence both electing black politicians and taxes per capita. All right. So the variable that Logan's going to come up with here is the number of free black residents in the county in 1860. So prior to the Civil War, when the majority of the black population of the South is still enslaved, right, there are free black residents. They show up in the census. Okay, so they're enumerated in the regular population census. So we can get counts of where free black residents lived in the South. And you can find which counties had more free black residents, which counties had fewer free black residents. What Logan shows is that this is a pretty strong predictor for electing a black politician after the Civil War, right? In large part, if we go back to our table here, because notice that these black officials, right, only about a third of them were born a slave. So we're actually talking about black individuals in the South. The ones who are going to become black officials are largely being drawn from the free black population, right, as it stood before the Civil War. And so that makes it pretty clear that a county with more free black residents is going to be more likely to have black politicians after the Civil War. Okay? So that takes care of finding an instrument that's correlated with the independent variable we care about, with the number of black politicians. Okay? The other thing this instrument has to do is it can't be correlated with the other county characteristics that might drive changes in taxes per capita. And so I won't go into too much detail about this. You can go into Logan's paper and see that he kind of tests correlations of number of free black residents in 1860 with all kinds of county characteristics in 1870, and sort of shows that you can't find much there that you can't control for just by including more variables in your regression. But I'm going to leave this as a question to you, something to think about, something you can reflect on when you write your one-page essay on all of this, to think about whether you buy this as an instrument. Do you really think that the only way that the number of free black residents in 1860 in a county is going to influence taxes per capita in that county in 1870 is through this channel of how many black officials that county elects? All right, so an open question there for you to think about. For the moment, let's say that you buy that. All right, let's say you buy this as a good instrument. If you think it's a good instrument, then estimation is going to go forward in the following way. All right, you start with what we call a first stage regression. What this is you take the independent variable we're going to instrument for, so number of black politicians or number of black officials from your county, and you regress it on your instrument. In this case, the number of free blacks in that county in 1860. Okay, so the coefficient that you get from that regression is going to tell you, all right, if you look at variation in free black population in 1860, right, how does that predict how many black officials you elect in 1870? Right? And the coefficient is going to tell us if you add one more free black resident in 1860, how many more black officials do we expect in 1870? Okay? So now, instead of running a regression of taxes per capita on number of black officials, right, you run a regression of taxes per capita on predicted number of black officials based just on how many free black residents you had in 1860. What that does is it pulls out just that variation in the number of black officials that's being driven by our instrument and gets rid of all the variation driven by all the unobserved stuff that we're worried about. Okay? So that's our second stage. That's going to give us our estimate of how changing the number of black politicians or elected officials in your county influences taxes per capita. So here we go. These are the results. Okay? So first stage results is what this number is down here. Okay, so first stage is saying if you use the number of free blacks in 1860 to predict the number of black elected officials, you get this super strong, highly statistically significant positive coefficient. So it is indeed the case that having more free black residents in 1860 makes you more likely to observe black elected officials in 1870. Okay, so now, right, when we go in and see, okay, if we use that variation in number of black officials per county driven by free black population in 1860, so that second regression, what's the impact of that variation on taxes per capita? That's what this IV row of coefficients is talking about. Okay. So remember I said the OLS said about a 10-cent increase in taxes per capita for each additional black elected official. Well, it turns out that when we do this new instrumental variables approach, we get even stronger results, about 20 cents per capita. So it's an even bigger effect than we thought. All right. So we can split this up. Remember I showed you in the summary statistics that we have judicial officials, we have executive officials, we have legislative officials. Right? Well, it's really the legislative officials that control the purse strings, right? Congress controls the purse strings. They're the ones that decide to change tax rates. They're the ones that decide to approve budgets, okay? So when you take this instrumental variables approach, this is this final column here, right? When Logan splits up the politicians by type of politician, there's no statistically significant effect for judicial officials. There's no statistically significant effect for executive officials, right? Where we get the strong statistically significant effect is for legislative officials. And so that's exactly consistent with saying, well, which officials matter for who decides on the budget, right? And so that really kind of increases Logan's case, strengthens his case that black officials matter for determining public goods spending. Okay. All right, so did this public goods spending matter? Did this help close black-white gaps in outcomes? We don't have much data we can look at in terms of outcomes. We don't have income data back then. We don't have good wealth data during this time period. So the one outcome we can really look at, the one thing that shows up in the census, is literacy. So we can think about the black literacy rate. And that's what this table is looking at. Okay? So if you have these black officials and they're spending more money on public goods, one of the key public goods they could spend it on were better schools. All right? Particularly better schools for black students. And so what you're looking at this table is a regression where the outcome variable is now literacy rate for the black population. And it's a function of how many black officials you had, right? Whether you're old enough to have been in school when those black officials were in office, all right? So better schools shouldn't impact somebody who's 40 in terms of whether they're literate or not, because they're not going to attend that school. So this variable is just capturing, were you in school during Reconstruction? And this final thing is the interaction between black officials and were you in school, okay? So were you in school during Reconstruction gives you a higher probability of being literate because you're really being compared to people that were in school before Reconstruction, which is sort of terrible schooling as far as the black population is concerned, okay? So that positive coefficient makes sense. This next coefficient right here is the one we really care about. Did being in school during Reconstruction have a bigger effect on literacy when you had more black officials? These positive coefficients here all say yes, right? So that's suggestive evidence that additional black officials were making those schools even more productive for black residents of school age, okay? So that's consistent with this story that the black officials were raising taxes to spend more money on local education to help close these black-white gaps in literacy. So those are fascinating results, but what makes them even more fascinating is that Logan continues these results to look at 1880, right? And the reason why 1880 is fascinating is because it comes after the 1876 election between Tilden and Hayes, and this is the presidential election that effectively ends Reconstruction. So a little bit of history here, and there's much more that you can dig into if you're fascinated by this. But hotly contested presidential election here, and it looks like Tilden's going to take the vote. He's got the popular vote. In terms of the Electoral College vote, he's one vote shy of getting over the margin needed to win the presidency. But there's still 3 states that are too close to call. And so there are these stories about backroom deals where effectively a deal is struck that says, all right, we're going to let Rutherford B. Hayes have the election if he removes federal troops from the South, because federal troops are in the South to enforce these Reconstruction policies. So Hayes becomes our president, federal troops leave the South, and sort of these guarantees of the black right to vote are gone. And we talked about that a bit in the earlier video, that this is when these new literacy and poll taxes come in and straight up voter intimidation through violence and other means to basically disenfranchise black voters. So when those black voters get disenfranchised, what happens? All right. So I forgot that I included this for you. So these poll taxes are one of the examples of things coming in. Here's a $1 poll tax, as you can see in Louisiana. Is $1 a big deal? It is. So tying this into the Du Bois project that we worked on, here are 2 of the figures from Du Bois. So one analyzed the income and expenditure of 150 black families in Atlanta, and you can see at the lower range here, these families are earning on average $139 a year. So that's 1% of your annual income just to vote, right? Here's another way to think about it, another one of the Du Bois figures about family budgets, and I'll just point out the Blacksmith budget here. So $450 a year, and if you look closely at that, you'll see that that number is based on blacksmiths earning $1.50 a day for working 10 hours a day. So that $450 is coming from 10-hour work days, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Okay? So 2 things to point out there. You're making about 15 cents an hour, and you're being charged $1 to go vote. right? Or in Virginia's case, $1.50 for 1 year, or in your first year, $4.50. So that's pretty big, right? The other thing I'll point out is also on this figure, Du Bois notes that the white wage is $1.75 a day for blacksmiths. So that wage discrimination is meaning that these poll taxes are having a disparate impact on disenfranchising the black population relative to the white population. So these things are a big deal, and they effectively disenfranchise black voters. And that gets us to this final result from the Logan paper that's really kind of depressing, but reinforces his story. Okay? So in this bottom panel here, we're looking at how taxes per capita changed between 1870 and 1880. And so the difference here is in 1870, you have enfranchised black voters. In 1880, they're disenfranchised. And what happens now, in terms of the IV results, where we use that free blacks in 1860 to predict how many black officials you're going to have in 1870, well, in 1880, you're not going to have them anymore because you've lost the black voting bloc, all right? So we saw already that those counties with an extra black official had more spending per capita in 1870, but then what happens relative to other counties over the next decade? Well, when the black voters can no longer vote, that extra spending per capita goes back down, right? We see this drop in those counties that have an additional black official. And so those temporary gains in terms of public spending that was benefiting black education disappear as soon as the black population is once again disenfranchised, which is a really powerful and really depressing result from Logan's paper. So in the next video, we're going to think about when the black population gets fully re-enfranchised again in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to say almost fully is better to put it.